Hello, I'm EAC Chairman Thomas Hicks. May is Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI Heritage Month, and today I'm pleased to speak with Dr. Natasha Varner. Dr. Varner is the Communications and Public Engagement Director at Densho, a nonprofit organization that documents the testimonies of Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. This year is the 80th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, which led to thousands of Americans, mostly of Japanese descent, being incarcerated in internment camps during World War II. Many people may not be aware that the majority of these interned were American citizens and were eligible to vote. This is a dark period in American history. And with today's discussion, I hope we can highlight the perseverance of those Americans who were wrongly incarcerated and their struggle to vote, as so many of their freedoms were stripped away. Dr. Varner has written about the experience of Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, and I appreciate her joining me here today to discuss this topic. Thank you, Dr. Varner, for joining me. Can you tell us about your work at Densho and a little bit about what inspired your research on American citizens who were incarcerated during World War II and their effort to cast a ballot?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor to join you today. So Densho is a Japanese American history organization focused on documenting the stories of World War II incarceration, as you mentioned. And all the oral histories and archives we gather are available online for free. So we're basically like a free online museum and archive. And as you mentioned, this story has been underrepresented in American history and in classrooms. And so the work that I do as Densho's Communications and Public Engagement Director is, finding creative ways to get our archives and historical materials out to a broader public. And so part of that is through writing historical articles. And what inspired the research into voting in camps was, this kind of started in the lead up to the 2016 election. And as I'm sure you and many viewers will recall, that was an extremely contentious election for a number of reasons. But it was also the first presidential election since the Supreme Court had issued a 2013 ruling that invalidated key parts of the Voting Rights Act. So being the big history nerd that I am, I got really interested in, other instances of voter disenfranchisement and started looking into the case of voting in Japanese American concentration camps.
Wow, great. That's great. The Wartime Civil Control Administration said qualified citizen evacuees had the right to vote as any other citizen was unable to be present at his or her polling place, meaning that the federal government left it up to the states to determine the rules and logistics. Were there differences among the states in how they administered voting for internees?
Yeah, there were definitely a lot of differences, and really it was kind of what we'd call now a hot mess. Like people just didn't know how to make this happen. It was the first time that the U.S. government had to make major large-scale arrangements for an incarcerated civilian population to be able to cast absentee ballots. And it was kind of one of those figure this out as we go along and leave it to the states to determine, first of all, if Japanese Americans were going to vote in the states where they were incarcerated, or if they were going to vote in the states they had been removed from. And, just kind of going back to this idea of qualified citizen evacuees as they were referred to then, this, first of all, evacuee is a not very accurate term. It was used by the US government, but really these were forced citizens who'd been removed from their homes forcefully by the US government. And as you mentioned, about 2/3 of them were US citizens. And so those who were of voting age legally had the right to vote. And so, this meant that provisions had to be made for tens of thousands of citizens to vote using absentee ballots. And it did come down to a state-by-state decision about how to manage this, and really even a precinct-by-precinct decision about how to handle all these absentee ballots. And just to give, more concrete example, Japanese Americans who had lived in California before the war, they were instructed to vote in the precincts where they lived prior to incarceration, but there were laws that banned electioneering in camps. And so a lot of basically most of the people who were casting their ballots were doing it with little to no information about who or what they were voting for. And even so, in the 1942 election, LA sent out 2,000 absentee ballots, and only 500 of those were ever actually returned and considered to be qualified for and could be counted in the election. And so, this is just one example of how, even though Japanese Americans nominally had the right to vote while they were incarcerated during World War II, there were a lot of ways that they were disenfranchised from doing so.
I got some of that from the article that you wrote, which was fascinating. And I do remember a piece of that saying how some of the folks who were, if their names were of Japanese descent sounding, that they were disqualified because of various rules. And I just found that so parallel to some of the things that I've heard of that went on in the 60s and 70s as well, or 60s as well. Can you share with us some of the barriers that internees needed to overcome to be able to vote, and how these barriers changed over their period of incarceration?
Yeah, I can speak a little more to the example you just brought up. Early on, 1942 and 1943, there would be poll watchers, watching the counting of the ballots, and they would challenge any ballot that came in that had a Japanese surname on it, under the false pretense that Japanese Americans held dual citizenship. So they said that made them ineligible to vote in US elections. And so it's kind of, it's impossible to quantify how many ballots were thrown out based on this false understanding that people with a Japanese surname weren't allowed to vote. And so that kind of race-based meddling was pretty significant. And there was even a white supremacist group called the Native Sons of the Golden West, who organized in, they'd existed long before this, and they had been actually major proponents of anti-Japanese sentiment leading up to the war. But in 1942 and 1943, they actually sued the San Francisco County Register of Voters in an attempt to remove all Japanese Americans from the voter rolls, and to prevent them from voting for the duration of the war. And this actually, this ended up being a case that they tried to argue all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear it, but it ended up getting struck down. But there were pretty concerted efforts happening outside of camp to prevent Japanese Americans from voting. So that's one of the major barriers that happened early in the war. And then by the 1944 presidential election, it was still, the rules and the way voting happened there was still kind of up for negotiation, and it was still being decided on a state-by-state basis. And there was another big debate about whether or not Japanese Americans should vote in the states where they were being incarcerated, or if they should vote absentee in the states that they had been removed from. And yeah, for the most part, Japanese Americans ended up voting in the states where they had been removed from, but there were barriers even there. So for Japanese Americans who were removed from California, for example, and this is where the majority of, or the largest population of Japanese Americans incarcerated during the war was from California. So this is a pretty significant case. California mandated that in applying for an absentee ballot, individuals had to make it clear that they intended to keep California as their home state of residence and return there after the war, which was a difficult thing to do because there were a lot of barriers to moving back to California. And it's a hard thing to prove when you're unjustly incarcerated in another state. It's hard to prove that you plan to permanently reside in California. So that was one challenge. And And then there was this really narrow window where ballots could be received. So it was no more than 20 days and no fewer than 5 days that the ballots had to be received by the precinct. And so considering how challenging mail service was at that time, these rules really made it difficult for Japanese Americans to get the vote, get their votes counted. So yeah, they're two pretty significant examples of the barriers that they faced.
You touched a little bit on this about Japanese Americans moving back to California at the end of the war, but what effect did incarceration have on Japanese American civic participation overall after the war?
Yeah, so that really varied, honestly. And, you know, I think one other, before I talk about the post-war civic participation, I think, you know, it's pretty amazing to me that Japanese Americans were able to cast the vote at all while they were in camp. And there were a lot of debates among Japanese Americans about the importance of maintaining that kind of civic duty, even though their basic civil liberties had been denied by removing them and putting them in these camps in the first place. So that kind of discrepancy and nuance in terms of civic participation and what it looked like for Japanese Americans after the war really continued. You know, some people really doubled down on their patriotism and shows of, you know, I'm an American and this is what it looks like. I'm going to volunteer for the war. Whereas others, you know, vehemently refused the American project and basically opted out of American society, even to the point of renouncing their citizenship because of, you know, how unjustly they've been treated. So there's a really huge range of civic participation. And, you know, I think it's also really interesting that to see how some of that civic participation took the form of advocating for the rights of other groups. And you know, I'll talk about that more in a moment, but you had a lot of activists who emerged from Japanese American incarceration and became really visible in movements for civil rights. You know, Yuri Kochiyama is, of course, one of the most famous examples. She was involved in fighting for civil rights alongside Malcolm X and other very prominent civil rights leaders. And so, yeah, there's a very large range, but for the most part, you know, Japanese Americans, well, I mean, it's very generational and very hard to kind of generalize, but there were many cases in which Japanese Americans leaving the camp said, you know, we need to just reassimilate into American life, mainstream American life in all its forms, including civic participation. And of course, they received a lot of pressure to do that as well from the US government and from other civic groups. So it's not an answer, but.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. That's really fascinating to me. Have there been ongoing effects to participation and civic engagement that are still going on and being seen today?
Yeah, definitely. You know, the Japanese American Citizens League is one example of that, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But you know, even at Densho, we're a history organization, but we advocate for rights of other organizations, or not organizations, but other groups who are being marginalized and targeted. You know, when the Muslim travel ban was being presented, we were speaking out in support of the Muslim community, and you know, any echoes of Japanese American history and the way people are targeted for nationality or race in similar ways that seem like echoes of what happened to Japanese Americans. Were very vocal about you know, using the history as an example for just saying this is not a road we want to go down again. And there are a lot of other Japanese American groups and individuals that do the same thing.
Can you discuss the advocacy efforts of the Japanese American Civic League leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the contributions of those efforts in the civil rights movement in general?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about what the Japanese American Citizens League is first. They were an organization founded in 1929, and they actually were criticized by Japanese Americans, and this still is a long-standing kind of community rift over this, because the JACL cooperated with the US government during World War II because they fell in this camp of, we need to prove what good Americans we are. We need to be, we need to go along with this. This is our contribution to the war effort. Yeah, so they kind of went along with the US government and actually opposed some of the legal cases that were brought against the US government over World War II incarceration. But after the camps closed, they became pretty major advocates for Japanese American rights, and also expanded that out beyond the Japanese American community in really impressive ways. And this gets a little bit beyond my area of expertise, so I just want to say that my answer here is drawing from the historian Greg Robinson, and he wrote a really seminal book called After Camp that came out in 2012. And so he talks a lot about what the JACL did in the lead up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I just want to give due credit for that. But basically, JACL lawyers consulted with civil rights lawyers from the NAACP and the ACLU. They wrote amicus briefs. They showed up in court. And in some ways, just the support and the appearance in the courtroom of Japanese Americans, presented a really powerful reminder that race is not just a black and white problem. And it presented this reminder of, this is the extent to which race-based laws can go. We can unjustly imprison large portions of our citizenry. And, so it's just this powerful reminder of we don't want to walk this path again. And so that alone was really powerful, but really the amicus briefs that they submitted in support of cases involving education and racially restrictive housing covenants and that kind of thing did a lot to support these groups that were advocating for the rights of African Americans in the lead up to the Civil Rights Act. And then, Greg Robinson points this out, that really one of the most valuable contributions here is that they laid the foundation for what's called the doctrine of strict scrutiny, which basically it puts the onus on governing bodies to prove that there's exceptional justification for any law that's based on race. And so it makes it harder to pass laws and to kind of uphold laws that are based in discrimination. And so that was a major contribution of Japanese American lawyers and the JACL to the civil rights movement. And there's one case in particular that really shows how this played out. That's McLaurin versus Oklahoma. And that was a 1950 US Supreme Court case that basically prohibited racial segregation in professional and graduate education. And there are two important things from that. One is that the JACL filed an amicus brief there that invoked this doctrine, this is such a tongue twister, this doctrine of strict scrutiny. And so the JACL filed this amicus brief that invoked that, and that mentioned that their own wartime incarceration was a result of racial discrimination, and that all the cases that had been argued about that condemned the practice of racial discrimination as being unconstitutional. So this amicus brief was pretty significant. And then in the same case, the NAACP itself used this doctrine of strict scrutiny for the first time. And so, it shows the way that the Japanese American Citizens League's efforts had really come into play. And this was a significant case because the victory in that case set the precedent for the separate but equal clause in Brown versus Board of Education. So yeah, these are not minor contributions. And And I just want to mention that even though the JCL does have some kind of controversial origins, there's still, it's remarkable to me how long of a history they have in supporting these civil rights cases. Even to this day, they're advocating in support of African-American reparations. They're supporting HR 40 and, going above and beyond. And I would say in general that in working with the Japanese American community, it's so remarkable to me that they've used this instance of discrimination that caused a lot of suffering and loss for them. They've used this, not all of them, I don't want to speak in generalizations, but major portions of the Japanese American community use this history of their own community's experience of injustice as a platform for speaking out against other injustices and to advocate for the rights of others. And I think a lot about this because my background is Irish American, and I think Irish Americans and many other immigrant groups have assimilated into US society by distancing themselves from other marginalized groups and adopting practices of anti-Blackness and really doubling down on the American story of racism and xenophobia. And so it's really remarkable to me that there have been these major Japanese American movements that have done the opposite. They've used their story of marginalization to try to make things better for other people too. So I think about that almost every day in my work at Densho, and definitely in writing this article. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because when you were talking about these cases, I popped into my head of, I remember that from first year constitutional law. And so it's bringing back memories there. What lessons do you think we can learn from today, from the perseverance of these American citizens in terms of voting and being engaged citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a reminder that voting is such a privilege, and it's a privilege that a lot of people take for granted. And it's easy to forget how hard won these rights are. And so, I think that the efforts to which Japanese Americans went to preserve their own right and to continue voting in camp it's a lesson for, the importance of using that privilege and making sure that our voices are heard in elections, and using that privilege to make sure that other people are not marginalized in the way that Japanese Americans were during the war, even in the lead up to the war, when there were a number of laws and regulations that were based on race and made it extremely difficult for them to live as free American citizens. So yeah, it's pretty powerful lessons.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing this important part of history, American history, with us today. It's important to recognize the contribution of the diverse electorate in forming what American democracy is today. Our civil liberties and our right to vote is not something that we should ever take for granted, as you said. And I want to thank you for discussing this painful but important topic as you celebrate the contribution of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders this month. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.